Dear friends, let us continue our discussion on the evolution in stratigraphy second part. Evolutionary rates within evolving groups are far from constant. As has long been known, if we consider evolutionary rates in terms of production of new species and how long these taxa persist, a common and general pattern emerges in fossil groups. This is that in the initial stages of the life of a higher taxon, evolutionary change is much more rapid than it is later on. When a successful new animal group appears for the first time, usually with a new body plan or with a key adaptive innovation, there is a great initial evolutionary burst. New taxa proliferate rapidly and expand their geographical range quickly, and the new groups arising from these bursts became adapted to many environments. This process is known as adaptive radiation and is always a time of rapid evolutionary change, sometimes known as trachytelic evolution, and of higher production of species, genera, and possibly also families and orders. Adaptive radiation may be virtually global or geographically quite localized. Moreover, it may occur at almost any taxonomic level, but it is most strikingly illustrated by such phenomena as the initial diversification of invertebrates in the early Cambrian. The radiation of the Ordovician trilobites following the latter Cambrian extinctions, or the sudden origin and rapid proliferation of higher crustaceans in the early Carboniferous. A further example, though on a more spread out time scale, is the Jurassic evolutionary explosion of sea urchins, in which many higher successful and persistent orders diversified from an initial stock which had survived from the Paleozoic. The initial impetus for an adaptive radiation is commonly a new structural plan. In marine organisms, adaptive radiations are very often also linked with marine transgressions. For if new space is created and new environments generated, then opportunistic groups will arise to colonize them. Once the initial burst of diversification is over and the main groups are differentiated, the rate of species production slows down, and the species tend to survive longer. Originated by quantum evolution during the early stages of the radiation, it is during the lateral stages that phyletic microevolutionary change can play a part, for it allows adaptive fine-tuning such as slow change in the size through time or alteration in the timing of breeding cycles. If a particular species becomes extinct, it will probably be replaced by a new one from a related stock and will become tuned to its environment in the same way. If the origin of new species more or less equates with the extinction of the older ones, that is holotelic evolution, the lineage will survive and remain vigorous. If a species abundance is plotted against time, then their differential survival or extinction will give rise to clades, that is clusters of the branching lineages of particular shapes. For example, when initial evolution has been rapid and there is thereafter a slow and gradual decline, the resultant pattern will resemble a fir tree in outline. Conversely, though rarely, a more gradual increase in numbers of species followed by a relatively abrupt extinction produces a pattern of a paintbrush shape. More commonly, clade shape resulting from a rapid initial burst and expansion followed by a fairly rapid decline, though with some members persisting thereafter over long time periods, takes the form of a sprouting snowdrop bulb. In such a case, the survivors continue as relicts long after the parent group which gave rise to them has disappeared. These survivors are living fossils continuing in the virtual absence of evolutionary change, that is bradytelic evolution. Such genera as Brachiopod lingula may be considered here. This genus was already in existence in the Upper Cambrian and since then has changed relatively little. It is able to survive because early on in history it colonized a difficult but persistent environment that of mudflats and shoals exposed at low tide. Those specimens are known from deeper waters also. There was relatively little competition for this since the physiological problems imposed by fluctuating salinity and periodic exposure are severe. But because Lingula was able to cross this adaptive threshold, which other invertebrates have already or rarely been able to do, there is no reason why it should not go on living in such an environment indefinitely. It is unlikely to be displaced by competitors. Some bradytelic animals now live in the quiet and stable waters of the deep sea. Hexactinellid sponges and the monoplacophoran mollusk Neopilina, whose most recent fossil relative is Middle Devonian, are amongst these. But the deep sea, though a stable enough environment and a haven for relic stocks, is not an ideal home because of the relatively limited food supply. These animals, which can cope with such unpopular environments, have a fair chance of becoming bradytelic under the influence of stabilizing selection. Relics of once important groups living thus may be restricted to certain habitats, but this does not necessarily mean that such living fossils are declining. Given the right conditions, these taxa could go on forever. Whereas mentioned above, they may inhabit environments for which there is little competition. It might be also that they have a wider environmental tolerance than do other animals. New views on the nature of living fossils are summarized in Aldridge and Stanley 1984. With the exception of living fossils, it seems to be the lot of all the taxa to become extinct. In some cases, there is a kind of relay or of the species, a new one coming in to occupy the vacant niche left by the extinction of a precursor. In particular groups, there seems to be a definite correlation between a high rate of speciation and a high extinction rate also. According to Stanley 1979, there are two reasons for this. One is that speciation and extinction are very high in small local populations. If a population becomes widespread, it limits further speciation in the area it inhabits, and its broad geographical spread is a bulwark against extinction. Though parts of a widespread population living in local areas may die out, mainly due to accidental factors, the whole population is less likely either to become extinct or to allow the production of new species from the same stock. A second factor documented by Stanley is that rates of speciation and extinction vary with behavior. Specialized behavior patterns are characteristics of the particular species, and if any species becomes too specialized, for example in food preferences, it may increase the vulnerability of that species to extinction through even minor environmental change. Throughout the history of life, individual taxa have originated, flourished for a longer or shorter time, and then become extinct. The demise of individual species has left little trace upon the broad pattern of evolution. Much more important, however, have been periods of mass extinction. But at this point, it is worth stressing that when, through major environmental catastrophes of one kind and other, many kinds of organisms are killed off simultaneously, the whole evolutionary pattern is disrupted. When such catastrophes happen, as they have many times within the Phanerozoic, whole ecosystems collapse along with their component organisms. All the adaptations of individual species, the result of successful initial evolutionary bursts and of subsequent fine-tuning over millions of years, are simply wiped together with all the delicate ecological balances between species. When the normal conditions are restored again after such a mass extinction period, and especially if there is a subsequent marine transgression opening up new space and habitats, then evolution resumes, based upon new adaptive variations and on the development of new ecosystems. Mass extinctions, more than any other factor, control the whole pattern of the evolution of life by resetting it from time to time in new and different combinations. It seems indeed to be the case that major physical or environmental catastrophes have caused more large-scale change than has competition between organisms. So we should now consider what the role of competition has been. Coming to the second module, that is competition and its effects. Darwin emphasized the role of competition as an important factor in natural selection. It is clear that competition for food, living space and mates is a primary control within a single species or population. This is competition in simple biological or ecological terms. Such competition may be direct in terms of aggression and the establishment of a hierarchical order within certain kinds of higher animal societies. On the other hand, it may be indirect in terms of too many individuals passively exploiting the available food supply. But what are the effects of the competition between species, especially if one invades the territory of another, or if the geographical ranges of two species overlap? Undoubtedly, interspecific competition is highly important, as is witnessed by the catastrophic reduction of the native British population of red squirrels after the introduction of the American gray squirrels in the 19th century. There are now very few red squirrels left in Britain after only about 100 years. An invading species may be expected to fail to displace an established species, to take over part of its range and set up a territorial balance to infiltrate and take up a previously unoccupied niche, or to eliminate the native species entirely. How often the latter happens is not clear, for in the fossil record, abrupt faunal breaks may be signifying the migration of an allopatrically derived species into an area after the native shock has become extinct enough or extinct through environmental or other causes. Quite commonly, neither species become extinct, and competitive elimination between the sympatric species, that is species living in the same area, may be avoided. By the variety of the adaptive strategies, one way is a spatial segregation. The animals come to inhabit and feed only within the strictly localized, geographically or vertically depth-restricted habitats. Hence, two sympatric species are not directly competing for food or living space. Another strategy is character displacement, either in sympatric species or where the range of the neighboring species overlap geographically. In the latter case, some rather curious reactions between the two species with their similar ecological requirements are set up. Either the individual in the range of overlap may come to look very similar to those of the competing species, or alternatively they may diverge in a character to a greater or much greater degree than normal. Evolutionary convergence may be interpreted as a strategy for coexistence which would minimize the effects of the selection so that it would operate upon all the individuals in the range of overlap as if they were just one species and not two competing ones. Divergence of the characters, on the other hand, suggests selection within two species for slightly different habitats so that competition is avoided by habitat proliferation. Cases illustrating these are known from the fossil record. In Cambrian agnostic trilobites, there is evidence of depth segregation as well as geographical separations also in closely related species, and at the same time size displacement seems to operate in several species. It has been predicted that in order to be an effective strategy for avoiding competitive elimination, size displacement would need to be in the ratio of about 1:1:28 for sympatric species. The fossils investigated, including these agnostics, seem to come remarkably closely to this theoretical figure. Eldridge 1974a has shown how during Devonian times in North America there lived two species of the large trilobite or Phacopes euvenesis inhabited the western area, whereas successive allopatrically derived subspecies of Phacopes rana, probably originating as a European invader, occupied the terrain to the east. The species range of the two did not normally overlap, a case of non-competitive geographical separation, but where the two species are found together, P. rana and P. eutuensis or eutuenus mutually reacted. P. eutuenus diverged in morphology from P. rana, whereas P. rana converged, diverged or stayed neutral in different characters, exhibiting a mixed reaction. On the basis of these studies, Eldridge has suggested that character displacement may be no more than a magnified microcosm of the general pattern of interaction between two species, even when allopatric, provided that allopatry is sustained through competitive exclusion. Even though such mechanisms exist, competition does operate to limit species and perhaps to cause extinction at the interspecific ecological level to which we have referred. But does it operate at major extinction periods, and if so, how? Since competition has been identified as an evident agent in evolution, there was for a long time a generally, if lightly held view that competition alone was perhaps the most important cause for the extinction of some groups and their replacement by others. Although competition undoubtedly is the most important, the older view that particular taxa somehow became outdated and were gradually replaced by more efficient competitors is no longer seen as an adequate explanation for all types of apparent replacement. Though in some respects, for example, trilobites are biologically limited, lacking strong jaws and grasping equipment, these animals were not just for their own time but surely for all time remarkably well organized and highly functional creatures. Recent studies upon their functional morphology, for example, their complex mechanisms for enrollment as a defense against predators, hardly support the view that trilobites died out simply because they weren't much good. The history of trilobites, like that of so many other groups, is punctuated by a series of major and minor extinctions, some of which can be directly related to the physical events such as marine regressions and not to competition. At each of the major events, many trilobite groups became extinct more or less simultaneously. Those that were left continued to flourish for long periods of time. Some of these were then removed during the next critical event, and finally the last trilobites disappeared during the Great Permian Catastrophe, during which over 90% of the total shallow marine invertebrate biota became extinct. Coming to the third module, a case which may seem perhaps more directly related to the effects of competition was the replacement of brachiopods at the end of the Paleozoic by bivalves as the dominant marine sessile filter-feeding benthos. Brachiopods dominated the level bottom nearshore and shelf habitats during Paleozoic time, but they were able to share a number of habitats, especially in the nearshore region, with bivalves, and a long-term equilibrium was set up. From the Mesozoic onwards, however, this dominance was lost to the bivalves and brachiopods became restricted to certain habitats alone. Was this a direct consequence of competition, or were physical factors involved here too? There is no doubt that bivalves are much more effective filter feeders than are brachiopods. The pumping and filtering system of the bivalves is more efficient than the lophophore of brachiopods, though both systems are composed of filaments with beating cilia. But the organization of the bivalve feeding gill produces a relatively stronger current, and the net energy gain for bivalves is decidedly higher than in a brachiopod filtering apparatus of the same length. Moreover, the processes of the particle trapping, sorting and digesting in bivalves are highly effective by comparison with those in the brachiopods, and bivalves have in any case a greater environmental tolerance too. These and other factors collated by Steele, Petrovic, that is 1979, all indicate the relative physiological superiority of bivalves over brachiopods and suggest that competition cannot be dismissed as a factor in faunal replacement. Even so, the replacement of brachiopods by bivalves was not directly due to a competitive takeover, but the result of one major episode in the Permian extinction crisis, as Gold and Galloway 1980. This affected brachiopods more severely than bivalves. The latter weathered the storm better due no doubt to their physiological superiority. Competition was undoubtedly intensified during the Permian, and the brachiopod-dominated communities were disrupted. When the crisis was over, the bivalves moving from their original nearshore habitats were able to colonize the new vacant or the now vacant ecospace previously occupied by the brachiopods. It was here that the physiological superiority of bivalves was so important, for they responded differently to the mass extinction period than did brachiopods. They were not too seriously affected by the Permian crisis. Subsequently, they recovered and underwent a major radiation, whereas the brachiopods lost their former dominance and remained of low diversity thereafter. Here, of course, direct competition for seafloor space and food may have had a tuning effect on the brachiopod bivalve bias, but the faunal replacement was in the first place set in motion by a major physical catastrophe. As Benton 1983 has shown, competition on its own increased the likelihood of the extinction in a lineage, but is unlikely to have been the only cause. Major catastrophes or physical changes, as demonstrated so often in the fossil record, have usually by themselves been sufficient. Coming to the fourth module, that is the summary or the conclusion of the paleontological evolution theory. Evolution can be defined as a change in gene frequencies through time. In any gene pool, most variations result from recombination of dominant and recessive alleles, but new variation is introduced by mutation, and under certain circumstances, mutant alleles can become dominant. In very small populations, much evolutionary change is non-adaptive because of the effects of genetic drift, but in larger populations, selections acting upon the variation present in the gene pool and leading to the adaptation is the primary force in evolutionary change. Molecular drive may be a third mechanism of evolutionary change, but like genetic drift is non-adaptive. A minority of new species may arise by the classic pathway of slow continuous change in a large population, but allopatric speciation is now believed to be much more important. Most new species arise as peripheral isolates on the fringes of the parent population, migrating wherever there is a vacant niche. Populations once established over a wide area tend to remain static, being stabilized by selection, unless there is a marked environmental change which increases the selection pressure. Such stasis is the norm for population, and the origin of new species is rather special and relatively rare event. Competition between species in a new environment may be direct in the initial stages before a balance is achieved, but in a more balanced community of a longer standing, a stable predator-prey ratio is maintained and competition is usually avoided, character displacement between similar types being one of the mechanisms. Some of the biotic associations are remarkably persistent over long periods of time, and these include co-evolutionary relationship. Microevolution refers to the origin of new species. This seems to take place by allopatric speciation in accordance with the predictions of populations. Dynamic theories. The overlay of the sedimentary record, however, obscures to a greater or lesser extent the actual process of speciation. Macroevolution refers to the process of evolution at higher levels, leading to major taxonomic discontinuities. Macroevolutionary species selection leads to the evolutionary trends observed in the fossil record. These are decoupled from microevolutionary trends. Adaptive radiation is a standard macroevolutionary phenomenon referring to the descendants of an original type, often with a key adaptation, undergoing a great burst of evolution and becoming adapted for specific habitats and niches. Such radiations are only possible where there is vacant ecospace. They usually take place where a formerly stable ecosystem has collapsed, and when mass extinctions have cleared the field for new kind of animals and new ecosystems to arise. Such mass extinctions based upon major physical changes are probably the most important factors underlying large-scale evolutionary changes. Thank you very much.